My name is Emma. I used to be the sister who tried too hard, until I learned that trying was never enough. It wasn't the first time she tried to shrink me in public, but that night at our cousin's engagement party, something in me refused to bend. The venue was one of those places where crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows on marble floors, where every conversation felt like a performance, and every laugh seemed rehearsed. My sister Melissa stood at the center of it all, gleaming, in a designer dress that probably cost more than my rent, surrounded by her polished friends like a queen holding court. I should have known better than to approach their circle. But family gatherings have a way of pulling you toward the very people who know exactly how to hurt you. "Oh, this is my little sister Emma," she announced when she spotted me hovering at the edge of their conversation. Her voice carried that particular tone she'd perfected over the years. Sweet on the surface, sharp underneath. She's between things right now. The way she said it made my recent job loss sound like a failed hobby. Something frivolous I dabbled in and abandoned. Her friends chuckled politely, their perfectly manicured fingers wrapped around cocktails that cost more than my weekly groceries. The sound of their laughter felt like tiny needles pricking my skin. "She still lives at home," Melissa added with that practiced smile of hers, the one that looked warm but aimed to humiliate. "But that's okay, right? Everyone needs time to figure things out." The words hit me like ice water. My cheeks burned, and I felt that familiar sensation of shrinking, of becoming smaller and smaller until I might disappear entirely. The background noise of the party, the clinking glasses, the soft jazz, the murmur of conversations, suddenly felt amplified, like a cruel soundtrack to my humiliation. Before we continue, drop a comment. Where are you watching this from? And what time is it there? I'd love to know how far this story is reaching. Sometimes when we feel most alone, we discover we're not the only ones carrying these quiet wounds. I wanted to disappear. I wanted to melt into the marble floor, or evaporate like the champagne bubbles floating in everyone's glasses. Instead, I smiled thinly. That weak, apologetic smile I'd learned to wear whenever Melissa decided to use me as her stepping stone. Excused myself with a mumbled something about needing air, and slipped away. My heart was thudding like a drum only I could hear, each beat echoing in my ears as I made my way through the crowd of successful, confident people who all seemed to belong in a way I never did. I had become the invisible sibling, present when needed, but only as contrast. The supporting character in Melissa's carefully curated life story. That night, alone in my childhood bedroom with its faded wallpaper and dusty trophies from a time when I still believed in myself, I replayed her words over and over. The way she held court, the practiced cruelty in her tone, the satisfied glint in her eyes when her friends laughed at my expense. It wasn't new. This was our pattern, our dance. She had always thrived on applause, especially when it came at someone else's expense. But here's what Melissa didn't know. What none of them knew: I wasn't actually between things. I was rebuilding. Quietly, deliberately, like a house constructed in the dark while everyone else slept. 3 months earlier, I had walked away from a job that was slowly killing my soul. The office politics, the micromanaging boss who treated creativity like a crime, the daily grind that left me feeling hollow and used up. I had finally said enough. It wasn't dramatic. I didn't storm out or make a scene. I simply typed my resignation letter on a Tuesday morning, printed it on company paper, and placed it on my supervisor's desk before walking out into a world that suddenly felt full of possibilities. My parents had been disappointed but not surprised. Emma always was impulsive, my mother had said with that particular sigh she reserved for my life choices. They didn't ask about my plans or offer support. They just waited for me to fail so they could say they'd seen it coming. But I didn't fail. I enrolled in online courses, digital marketing, content strategy, freelance writing. I spent my days learning things that actually excited me, things that made my brain light up in ways my old job never had. I started taking on small projects, writing blog posts and website copy under a pseudonym. The work was challenging and fulfilling in a way I'd almost forgotten was possible. Nobody knew about any of this. I liked it that way. For the first time in years, my life felt like it belonged to me. I remembered all the little betrayals that had led to this moment. How Melissa had told our mother about my failed calculus class in college, presenting it like breaking news at the dinner table. How she'd borrowed my prom dress without asking and returned it with a red wine stain that never came out, then laughed it off like it was no big deal. How she'd announced my first relationship to our extended family before I was ready, turning something precious and private into gossip fodder. Our mother had always laughed these things off. "Oh, she's just being playful," she'd say about Melissa. "Sisters tease each other. That's normal." But it never felt normal to me. It felt like death by 1,000 small cuts, each one insignificant on its own, but devastating in accumulation. I stopped expecting anyone to defend me. I started building distance instead, creating space between myself and the people who seemed to find my pain entertaining. And then, like morning light creeping through heavy curtains, something began to shift. My freelance projects multiplied. Word of mouth spread in the quiet, professional way that quality work tends to travel. A client I'd been ghostwriting for, a successful entrepreneur who ran a consulting firm, offered me a position on her team. Not as an employee trapped in someone else's vision, but as a partner in building something meaningful. With my new income, and the savings I'd accumulated from living so carefully, I leased a small apartment in a quiet part of the city. It wasn't fancy. Just a one-bedroom with hardwood floors and windows that faced east, filling the space with morning light. But it was mine. Every piece of furniture, every book on the shelf, every coffee mug in the cabinet was chosen by me, for me. I didn't tell anyone about the apartment. Not yet. Moving out would be a statement, and I wanted to make it on my own terms, in my own time. But first, I had something else in mind. A small indulgence, a quiet statement that I'd been planning since the night of the engagement party. 2 weeks later, at our grandmother's birthday celebration, I hired a driver. Not because I needed one, but because I wanted one. Because I could afford one. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to shrink. The event was being held at the same venue where Melissa had humiliated me, and I knew she'd be there with her usual entourage. I also knew that arriving in style would send a message I couldn't articulate with words, that I was no longer the sister who apologized for taking up space. I chose my outfit carefully. A simple black dress that fit perfectly, understated jewelry that caught the light just right, and shoes that made me feel tall and confident. I looked in the mirror before leaving and saw someone I almost didn't recognize. Someone who belonged in her own skin. The car arrived exactly on time. The driver, a kind man named Robert who treated his work like an art form, held the door open as I settled into the leather seats. As we pulled away from my new apartment, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. The quiet confidence that comes from knowing exactly who you are and refusing to apologize for it. When we arrived at the venue, Robert stepped out first and walked around to open my door with the practiced grace of someone who understood that small gestures could carry enormous weight. As I emerged from the car, I saw heads turning, including hers. Melissa stood near the entrance with her usual circle of friends, but her confident posture faltered when she saw me. She blinked, confusion flickering across her features like a glitch in her perfect composure, then recovered with a smile that was too bright, too forced. "Emma, you're here," she said, her voice pitched higher than usual. There was something different in her tone, uncertainty, maybe even a hint of nervousness. "I am," I replied calmly, smoothing my dress as Robert discreetly returned to the car. "I had a few things to finish up at work, but I wouldn't miss Grandma's party." The word work hung in the air between us like a challenge. Her friends, who, had been chattering about weekend plans and vacation destinations, suddenly turned their attention to me with genuine interest. "What kind of work do you do?" asked Sarah, the blonde one who had laughed the loudest at my expense during the engagement party. I smiled, feeling a warmth spread through my chest that had nothing to do with the champagne being served. Consulting. Content strategy. Mostly corporate clients. I help businesses tell their stories in ways that actually connect with people. It was the truth, simple and clear. No embellishment needed. The questions came naturally after that. What kind of clients did I work with? How did I get started? Was I hiring? Each question felt like validation, like proof that I had built something real and valuable from the ashes of my old life. Melissa stood silent throughout this exchange, her eyes flicking between me and the car that was still parked elegantly at the curb, then back to me. There was no need to explain anything more. The picture spoke for itself. Her little sister, who was supposedly between things, had arrived in style, spoke confidently about meaningful work, and carried herself like someone who had found her place in the world. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the foil in her spotlight. I was my own stage. The evening continued, but something fundamental had shifted. People approached me throughout the night, distant relatives I barely remembered, family friends, who had always overlooked me before, even some of Melissa's inner circle. They wanted to know about my work, my apartment, my plans. They listened when I spoke, instead of waiting for their turn to talk. My grandmother, sharp as ever at 85, pulled me aside during dinner. "You look different, sweetheart," she said, her weathered hand covering mine. "Stronger, like you finally figured out who you are." I squeezed her hand, feeling tears prick at the corners of my eyes. "I think I have, Grandma." "Good," she said firmly. "It's about time. I've been waiting for you to stop apologizing for existing." Her words hit me like a gentle earthquake, shifting something deep in my foundation. Had I really spent so many years apologizing for existing? The answer was yes, and recognizing it felt like waking up from a long, uncomfortable dream. As the evening wound down, I found myself in the ladies' room, touching up my lipstick in the ornate mirror. Melissa appeared behind me, her reflection joining mine in a way that suddenly felt symbolic. Two sisters, side by side, but no longer in the same story. "So," she said, her voice carefully casual. "The consulting thing, that's new." "Not really," I replied, capping my lipstick and turning to face her. "I've been building it for months. You just never asked." She shifted uncomfortably, her designer heels clicking against the marble floor. "And the apartment? What about it? Sarah mentioned you moved out. When were you going to tell the family?" The question carried weight beyond its words. What she was really asking was, when were you going to tell me? When did you stop needing my permission to live your life? "I tell people things when I'm ready," I said simply. "I've learned that some news is better shared when it's already solid, when it can't be undermined or dismissed." The silence stretched between us, filled with years of unspoken hurts and unacknowledged truths. For a moment I thought she might apologize, might acknowledge the pattern of belittling that had defined our relationship for so long. Instead, she adjusted her dress and walked toward the door. "Well," she said, her voice artificially bright. "Good for you, Em. Really." But she didn't insult me again that night, or the night after, or ever again, actually. The weeks that followed brought a series of small revelations. My parents, who had been skeptical of my career change, began asking genuine questions about my work. My mother even referred a friend who needed help with her small business website. It wasn't a grand gesture of support, but it was acknowledgement, and that felt like progress. My client base continued to grow through word of mouth and strategic networking. I started speaking at local business events, sharing insights about authentic storytelling, and building genuine connections with audiences. Each speaking engagement brought new opportunities, new collaborations, new proof that I had found my calling. 6 months after that transformative birthday party, I was invited to speak at a major marketing conference in the city. The venue was impressive, a modern convention center with floor-to-ceiling windows and state-of-the-art technology. As I stood backstage, adjusting my presentation slides and reviewing my notes, I felt a familiar flutter of nerves mixed with excitement. The topic of my talk was finding your voice, how personal authenticity transforms professional communication. It was drawn directly from my own experience, from the journey of discovering that my greatest strength wasn't in trying to be someone else, but in fully becoming myself. As I walked onto the stage, the spotlight warm on my face, and an audience of hundreds waiting to hear what I had to say, I thought about that night at the engagement party, about the girl who had smiled apologetically and slipped away from laughter that felt like cruelty. She felt like someone I used to know, someone I had outgrown like childhood clothes that no longer fit. My presentation went beautifully. The audience was engaged, asking thoughtful questions and nodding at insights that I had learned through experience rather than textbooks. During the Q&A session, a woman in the front row raised her hand. "Your story is so inspiring," she said. "I'm curious, was there a specific moment when you decided to stop playing small and start taking up the space you deserved?" The question caught me off guard, not because I didn't know the answer, but because the answer was so clear, so crystalline in my memory. "Yes," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the microphone. It was the moment I realized that waiting for other people's permission to value myself was like waiting for rain in a drought. You can wait forever, or you can find your own water. The audience laughed appreciatively, but I meant every word. I had spent years waiting for Melissa to see my worth, for my parents to recognize my potential, for employers to appreciate my contributions. I had given other people the power to define my value, and they had consistently undervalued me because I had undervalued myself. After the conference, I treated myself to dinner at a restaurant I'd always wanted to try but had never felt worthy of entering. As I sat alone at a table by the window, watching the city lights twinkle like earthbound stars, my phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Melissa. "Saw the photos from your conference on LinkedIn. Looked amazing. Proud of you." I stared at the message for a long time, waiting for the rush of validation I had once craved from her approval. But it didn't come. Instead, I felt something quieter and more powerful. Indifference. Her opinion of me no longer held the weight it once did, because I had learned to trust my own judgment about my worth. I typed back a simple, "Thank you," and put my phone away. The gesture felt complete, like closing a book I had been reading for too long. That night, in my apartment that had become truly home, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this place. It hadn't been dramatic or sudden. There was no moment of explosive confrontation, no grand gesture of revenge. Instead, it had been a gradual process of choosing myself, day after day, decision after decision, until choosing myself became as natural as breathing. I had learned that the most powerful response to being diminished isn't to diminish others in return, but to grow so fully into yourself that their attempts to shrink you become irrelevant. I had learned that dignity isn't something you demand from others, but something you cultivate within yourself and carry everywhere you go. My business continued to flourish, built on a foundation of authenticity and genuine connection. I hired my first employee, then my second. I moved to a larger apartment with a home office and space for the life I was building. I traveled for work, spoke at more conferences, wrote articles for industry publications. But perhaps the most meaningful change was in my relationships. I began attracting people who appreciated authenticity over performance, who celebrated success without needing to minimize others, who understood that supporting each other made everyone stronger. A year after the grandmother's birthday party, I attended another family gathering. This time it was my cousin's wedding. The same cousin whose engagement party had been the scene of my humiliation. As I prepared for the event, I realized I felt no anxiety, no dread, no need to rehearse confident responses to potential slights. I arrived in my own car this time, not because I needed to make a statement, but because I preferred the independence. I wore a dress I loved, carried myself with the easy confidence that comes from knowing exactly who you are, and entered the venue feeling genuinely excited to celebrate love and family. Melissa was there, of course, surrounded by some of the same friends who had laughed at my expense years before. But the dynamic was different now. When she introduced me, she did so with genuine respect. "This is my sister Emma," she said to a new addition to their group. "She runs her own consulting company. She's incredibly talented." The words were simple, but they carried weight because they were true and offered freely. I smiled and joined. The conversation naturally, sharing stories about my work when asked, but also asking genuine questions about their lives and interests. Later that evening, as the reception wound down and guests began to drift away, Melissa and I found ourselves standing together on the venue's terrace, looking out at the city lights. "I owe you an apology," she said quietly, her voice carrying none of its usual performative quality. "I spent a lot of years making you smaller so I could feel bigger. That wasn't fair, and it wasn't right." I looked at her. This sister who had shaped so much of my early understanding of my place in the world, and felt something shift one final time. Not forgiveness exactly, that had come gradually as part of my own healing, but a kind of completion. "Thank you for saying that," I replied. "It means something." "I was jealous, you know," she continued. "You always seemed so real, so genuine. I felt like I had to perform all the time to get attention, but authenticity came naturally to you. I think I resented that." Her honesty surprised me, but it also made sense. We had each been fighting different battles, seeking different things, without really understanding what the other was struggling with. "We were both just trying to figure out how to be ourselves," I said. "Maybe we both needed to grow into who we really are." She nodded, and for a moment, we stood in comfortable silence. Two women who had finally learned to take up their own space without needing to diminish each other. As I drove home that night, I thought about the girl who had once smiled thinly and slipped away from cruel laughter. She had been brave in her own way, surviving in a world that felt hostile and unwelcoming. But she had also been incomplete, waiting for others to give her permission to exist fully. I had learned that no one else can give you that permission. You have to take it for yourself, quietly and consistently, until it becomes as natural as your own heartbeat. My phone buzzed with notifications, new client inquiries, speaking requests, collaboration opportunities. My calendar was full of meaningful work and genuine connections. My apartment was a sanctuary I had created for myself. My life was mine, fully and completely, in a way I had never imagined possible. The driver who opened the door for me that transformative night had been a symbol, a visual representation of treating myself with the respect I deserved. But the real door he opened wasn't to a car. It was to a version of myself I had always carried inside but had never had the courage to fully become. And once that door opened, I discovered that there were countless others waiting beyond it, each one leading to new possibilities, new growth, new ways of being in the world that honored both my strength and my authenticity. They used to dismiss my presence, but they couldn't delete my worth, because I had finally learned to write it myself.